Before the first word of tonight's story reaches you, consider this. The bloodiest war in Westerosi history, the War of the Five Kings, was not caused by ambition alone. It was made possible by a structural flaw baked into the continent's foundations 12,000 years before a single crown was ever forged. No king in the history of Westeros ever truly owned his army. Not one. And that absence of ownership killed more people than any dragon ever did. Let your breathing slow now. Whatever you carried into this moment, you can set it down. There is nothing pressing tonight, nothing that cannot wait until morning. Simply allow the sound of this voice to become the only thing tethering you to wakefulness, and let everything else begin to soften at the edges. We are going a long way back tonight, not merely to the Targaryen conquest nor to the Andal invasion, but further, to the very architecture of how power was organised in Westeros, to the invisible scaffolding beneath every throne and every war and every betrayal the continent has ever known. We are going to the root of something, and once you see it, you will understand why the world you thought you knew was always more fragile than it appeared. There is a question that most people who love this story never quite think to ask. They see the armies, they see the banners unfurling, the lords riding out, the swords drawn and shields raised, but they do not ask, whose army is that truly? Who trained those men? Who fed them through winter? Who has the legal and moral authority to disband them, or redirect them, or simply refuse to march? The answer in Westeros is almost never the king, and that answer is a catastrophe waiting to happen across every era of the continent's history. Settle a little deeper into wherever you're resting now. Let the weight of your limbs feel heavier, pleasantly so, the way they feel after a long and honest day. There is nothing you need to hold on to tonight. Let the stories carry you instead. The system that governed Westeros for the majority of recorded history was, at its structural core, a system of conditional loyalty. A great lord, a Tully, a Stark, a Lannister, a Tyrell, owed fealty to the throne on paper. He bent the knee during coronations, he attended tourneys and councils, he sent ravens in times of war, but the men-at-arms who filled his halls, the soldiers who slept in his barracks, the knights who swore their oaths in his sept or his gods would, those men belonged to him, not to the crown, to him. This distinction seems simple on the surface, almost legalistic, the kind of thing that only matters in the fine print of a contract. But it is not simple at all. It is the single most consequential structural feature of Westerosi civilization, because what it means, in practice, is that every king who ever sat the Iron Throne sat there at the sufferance of men who were never truly his subjects. They were his partners, his silent co-investors in the project of rule. And like any partner, they reserved the right to renegotiate the terms. It is worth pausing on that thought for a moment. 12,000 years of history, conquest after conquest, dynasty after dynasty, and not one of them ever broke this pattern in any permanent way. The Targaryens came closest. They had dragons. They had fire made living, fire that could reduce a lord's castle to slag and his army to ash. And even they, even Aegon the Conqueror himself, chose not to replace the great houses with royal administrators, loyal only to the crown. He kept the lords, he kept the structure, he changed who sat at the top of it and left everything beneath intact. Why would he do that? Why would the most powerful conqueror in the history of Westeros decline to restructure the very system that would, 300 years later, permit his dynasty's downfall? The answer tells us something uncomfortable about the nature of power, something the Targaryens understood intuitively even if they never articulated it cleanly. You cannot govern a continent the size of Westeros from a single throne room. You cannot project force into every valley and every holdfast and every fishing village from King's Landing. You need the lords, you need their local authority, their inherited legitimacy, their knowledge of the land and its people. Without them, you don't have a kingdom. You have a city surrounded by wilderness that answers to no one. And so the bargain was struck, and restruck, and struck again with each new dynasty and each new conquest. The lords kept their men, the lords kept their swords, the lords kept their right to determine in any given moment of crisis whether their loyalty to the crown still outweighed their loyalty to their own interests. What the crown received in exchange was the use of those men during times of war, conditional use, bounded use that could be withdrawn the moment the political mathematics shifted. Let your eyes rest completely now. If they are still open, allow them to close. There is nothing to see tonight except the long darkness of history unspooling, and you do not need your eyes for that. You only need to listen. The deeper you look at this arrangement, the more clearly you can see how it was not merely a political structure. It was a philosophy about the nature of authority itself, a philosophy that Westeros absorbed so completely it ceased to recognise it as a philosophy at all and simply called it the natural order of things. Lords rule their lands, kings rule the lords, everyone rules someone and everyone answers to someone, and the whole edifice rests on an agreement that is never written down in any single document, because writing it down would require admitting how contingent it truly is. Think of what a standing royal army would have meant, had any monarch been bold enough, or desperate enough, to build one. Not a lord's retinue, not a conscript levy that dissolves when the fighting ends. A permanent professional force, uniformed and paid from the royal treasury, answering solely to the crown. Such an army would have changed everything. It would have given the king a presence in every region that did not depend on the goodwill of the local lord. It would have made the threat of royal displeasure something more than a strongly worded raven. It would have made betrayal something the great houses calculated very differently. But that army was never built, and there are reasons for that failure that go far beyond mere oversight or lack of imagination. There are reasons buried in the economics of medieval grain supply, in the geography of a continent with no efficient road network, in the psychology of a nobility that would have correctly perceived such an army as an existential threat to its own power. The lords would not have permitted it. That is the uncomfortable truth. The great houses of Westeros were not merely beneficiaries of the feudal system, they were its enforcers. Any king who moved too decisively toward independent military power would have found the very lords he was trying to reduce standing together against him in the one form of unity they could always achieve: unified self-interest. This is the echo that Ned Stark carries into King's Landing, a man of profound personal honour, raised in a system where honour is the currency that substitutes for the institutional loyalty he has never had reason to question. He trusts the lords of the realm to behave as lords of the realm are supposed to behave, to honour the old compacts, to weight their oaths against their ambitions and find the oaths heavier. He is not naive. He has been to war. He knows men are capable of treachery. What he does not fully reckon with is that the structure itself, the beautiful, ancient, terrible structure, has treachery built into its foundations, not as an aberration, as a feature. And so tonight, as you drift toward the long quiet, carry this with you. Every army in Westeros was a borrowed thing. Every king ruled on credit. Every moment of stability was a negotiation in progress. The wall between order and chaos was not made of stone. It was made of agreements, and agreements are only as permanent as the last moment both parties found them convenient. The stories will be here tomorrow. The history will keep. And for now, let that thought grow distant and soft like torchlight seen from a great height, and let yourself rest. The geography of Westeros made this structural vulnerability worse in ways that are easy to underestimate. A continent stretching nearly 3,000 miles from the wall in the north to the summer sea in the south, with mountain ranges that divided its interior into natural regional compartments, with rivers that served as borders rather than highways, with no single road network capable of moving troops efficiently from one end to the other. This was not a geography designed for centralized military command. It was a geography that almost insisted on regional autonomy, that rewarded the lord who knew his own terrain intimately and punished any distant power that tried to project force across it without local cooperation. The Iron Throne sat at the nexus of several of these natural regions, which was a geographic advantage for commerce and communication, but the advantage it conferred in military terms depended entirely on the willingness of the regional lords to act as the throne's agents in their own territories. Consider what the reach meant in this equation. The most populous and agriculturally rich region of Westeros, governed by House Tyrell from the incomparable Highgarden, was capable of fielding an army that dwarfed anything the crown itself could muster independently. The Tyrell armies in their full strength represented more fighting capacity than the Iron Throne had available, through any combination of direct assets. The Tyrells understood this, of course. Great houses always understood their own leverage, even when they declined to deploy it overtly. Their flowering golden rose was not merely a heraldic choice, it was a statement about the nature of their power. Beautiful, fragrant, rooted in the rich soil of the Reach, growing from an agricultural base that no rival could easily match or replicate. And like a rose, their military power had thorns that were entirely theirs, not the crown's. The Starks, in their cold northern stronghold, had a different relationship with military power than the great houses of the south, and that difference tells us something important about how the feudal system was experienced differently across the continent's regions. In the north, the distances were vast, the winters were harder, and the threat from beyond the wall was historically more immediate and more understood than the political intrigues of King's Landing. Northern military culture was therefore more genuinely martial, less performative, than much of what passed for military culture in the south, less concerned with the pageantry of tournament and the calculations of court, more concerned with whether a man could actually fight and whether he could sustain that fighting through a month's march in conditions that would break a southern night in the first week. The Starks kept their banners close and trained them hard, not because they were uniquely virtuous, but because the North's geography and climate made negligence in these matters more immediately and visibly fatal than it was elsewhere. There is something worth sitting with in the contrast between northern and southern military culture. The Southerners were playing a more complicated game, one in which military power was only one piece on a board that included marriage alliances, debt obligations, trade relationships, and religious authority. The Northerners were playing a simpler game, but a harder one. When Robb Stark led his army south, he brought northern military competence into a southern political environment for which it was not designed, and the mismatch was catastrophic, not because his soldiers were outfought, but because his political acumen could not match the complexity of the game being played around him. The Bannermen system worked differently in the north than in the south, and assuming it worked the same way was one of the errors that cost him everything. The medieval period of the real world produced over centuries a gradual evolution of the relationship between lords and kings, a slow accretion of bureaucratic institutions, of written law, of increasingly formalized governance structures that began to shift military power from the purely personal to something more institutional. Westeros did not experience this evolution in the same way, partly because the magical and climatic irregularities of the continent disrupted the slow accumulation of institutional development, partly because the Targaryen dynasty's draconic power made structural reform feel unnecessary for 3 centuries when reform might have been most achievable. The result was a civilization that had the surface characteristics of a mature feudal society, its heraldry, its tourneys, its elaborate codes of honour and chivalry, without the underlying institutional development that, in the real world, eventually transformed feudalism into something more stable. Westeros was, in this reading, a feudal system frozen at an early developmental stage, preserved by magic and dragons and the particular catastrophes of the Long Night, and therefore uniquely vulnerable when the dragons died and the cold returned. Here is the detail that historians of Westeros rarely confront directly. Aegon the Conqueror's real army on the field of fire numbered fewer than 1,500 soldiers. He conquered a continent with 1,500 men and 3 dragons, which means the moment the last dragon died, the moment Aegon's descendants lost their one genuine military advantage, the Targaryen dynasty became structurally identical to every house that had come before them. They just didn't know it yet. There is a particular quality to the hours just before deep sleep arrives. The mind grows slower, not because it has lost interest in the world, but because the world has begun to feel less urgent, less sharp at its edges, more like a story being told at a comfortable distance than a series of demands requiring immediate response. Settle into that quality now. Let this voice be the distance. We are going to spend some time tonight with the Targaryens, not as conquerors at the height of their power, not with fire and shadow and the screaming of men on the field of fire, but in their more honest form, as a dynasty that understood, with unusual clarity, that it had substituted one kind of military power for another without ever truly solving the underlying problem. When Aegon Targaryen landed at what would become King's Landing with his 2 sisters, his dragons and his handful of loyal followers, he was not operating from a position of overwhelming conventional strength. The Targaryens of Dragonstone were a minor house, wealthy by the standards of a small island, but not a great house in any traditional sense. They had no vast network of bannermen, They had no ancient claims stretching back to the Age of Heroes. What they had was Balerion. What they had was Meraxes and Vhagar. What they had was the capacity to make a lord's ancient stronghold irrelevant in a single afternoon. Let that settle for a moment. The entire Targaryen dynasty, 300 years of rule, everything from Aegon's coronation to the Mad King's fall, was built on a foundation that was never institutional. It was biological, 3 living creatures, and living creatures, unlike castles, unlike navies, unlike trained military corps, do not last. They get sick, they get killed, they stop being born, and when they are gone, what remains is a king with a grand title and no structural advantage whatsoever. Allow your breathing to find its own rhythm now. Not forced, not controlled, simply noticed. In and out, slow and full, the oldest rhythm in the world. Let your thoughts ride that rhythm rather than fighting it. The Targaryens recognized this danger, though they perhaps did not articulate it to themselves in quite these terms. Their response was the Dragon Seeds program, the Dragonstone cradles, the careful husbanding of dragon eggs, the encouragement of dragon bonding across the family line. They were, in essence, trying to maintain their standing army by ensuring the army kept reproducing. For the first century and a half of their rule, this worked. Dragons begat dragons. The dynasty's unique military advantage was self-sustaining, even self-expanding. But biology is not policy. Biology does not respond to administrative instruction. The dragons began to sicken during the reign of Jaehaerys I's successors, and while scholars have proposed many theories for why, the confining of dragons to the dragon pit, selective breeding that narrowed the genetic pool, the slow withdrawal of magic from the world, no one in the royal court fully understood what was happening until it was nearly over. The dragons shrank, then they stopped being born at all, and by the time the last dragon died, small and blind and sad in its dragon pit, the Targaryens had been ruling for so long on the assumption of draconic power that they had never built anything to replace it. This is where the story becomes genuinely tragic, in the structural sense rather than the personal one. The Dance of the Dragons, that terrible civil war in which Targaryen dragon riders burned each other from the sky, while the small folk fled their villages and the great houses watched carefully to see which way to place their bets, was not merely a war over succession. It was a war that consumed the very military advantage that made Targaryen rule possible. Every dragon that died in the dance was a fraction of the dynasty's foundational power burning away. And when it ended, with most of the great dragons dead and the survivors diminished, what remained was a Targaryen king sitting on a throne designed for a dragon lord without dragons, attempting to rule through the same feudal mechanisms that had failed every king before him. It is worth pausing on this for a long, quiet moment, because the Dance of the Dragons is remembered primarily as a story of personal ambition. Rhaenyra against Aegon, green against black, mother against uncle, and it was those things. But beneath the personal drama was a structural catastrophe of the First Order. The Targaryens burned their irreplaceable military advantage in a family dispute, and they did it not because they were uniquely foolish or uniquely cruel, but because the feudal system they had always relied on for everything except direct military confrontation had no mechanism for preventing it. The Great Lords chose sides, the Great Lords marched their armies, and the Targaryens, instead of standing above the feudal system as they had during the Conquest, became captured by it. Let the images soften now. You do not need to hold on to any of this with effort. The mind absorbs what it absorbs, and the rest drifts away like smoke from a cooling fire. Daenerys Targaryen, 3 centuries removed from the dance and a full world away from Westeros, understands something about her inheritance that her ancestors could not have articulated from within it. She understands, instinctively and through the specific cruelty of her own experience, that a ruler without independent military power is not truly a ruler at all. Her dragons are not trophies to her. They are not symbols of heritage. They are her answer to the problem that destroyed her family. They are the standing army that Westeros never had and always needed. What she cannot fully see, what the tragedy of the final season gestures toward, however imperfectly, is that a standing army in the form of 3 living creatures carries the same fundamental vulnerability as every other arrangement before it. It depends on the creatures remaining alive. It depends on the bond rider remaining willing. It depends on 1,000 variables that no administrative system can guarantee. The moment one of her dragons falls to an ice spear beyond the wall, she loses not merely a weapon, but a third of her structural advantage in a single heartbeat. The problem is older than she is. It is older than her dynasty. It is baked into the continent itself. The Targaryen kings who came after the dance attempted various compensations. They married into great houses. They cultivated the loyalty of the Gold Cloaks. They relied increasingly on small councils of advisors whose power depended on royal favour. These were not solutions. They were workarounds, and they were workarounds that made the throne more dependent on the feudal system rather than less. By the time the Mad King sat the Iron Throne, the Targaryens had been structurally ordinary monarchs for well over a century. The Dragon Lord's throne had become a regular king's throne, with all the fragility that implies. And Aerys II never understood that. His madness was not only personal, it was the madness of a man who inherited the symbols of transcendent power without the substance, who spent his reign grasping at the feeling of being above the feudal order, burning lords rather than commanding them, refusing to see himself as dependent on anyone, while being, in the objective political sense, more dependent on the goodwill of his great lords than almost any king before him. His paranoia was not disconnected from political reality. It was an extreme response to a political reality that was genuinely threatening. The lords had always been more powerful than the throne. By his reign, that imbalance was simply impossible to ignore. Rest now. The dragons are all gone from the world for the moment, and the night is quiet, and there is nothing left to burn. Let the dark be soft around you, and let the story wait. The Targaryens' attempt to compensate for their declining draconic power through political marriage is one of the longest-running and most tragic miscalculations in the continent's history. By the time of Jaehaerys I, the conciliator, the king who genuinely tried to rule through wisdom and consensus rather than fire, the dynasty had begun the slow process of integrating itself more fully into the feudal system it had conquered, cementing alliances through betrothals and building institutional relationships with the great houses through his great council and his support for the codification of law. These were genuine achievements, and Jaehaerys was genuinely a better king than most who came before or after him. But the institutional infrastructure he built was designed for a world in which the dragons remained as a backstop, a final argument, available if needed, that gave every other negotiation a different quality. Remove the dragons, and what remained was a web of marriage alliances and political understandings that looked strong on paper and were considerably more fragile in practice. The Dragon Pit itself is a monument to the paradox at the heart of Targaryen rule. Built to house the great dragons, to protect them from the city, to protect the city from them, the pit was both a symbol of Targaryen power and, in retrospect, one of the contributing factors to the dragon's decline. Confining creatures of that size and wildness to an enclosed urban space, however large, was not a natural condition for them. The evidence in the history suggests that confined dragons grew smaller across generations, that the connection between dragon and rider became more fraught when the beast could not range freely across the sky, that the extraordinary animals that had burned the Lannister army at the Field of Fire were, within a few generations, already diminished versions of what their ancestors had been. The pit was an administrative convenience that was also a slow ecological disaster, and no one in the royal court seems to have recognised it as such until it was too late to reverse. Maegor the Cruel is the most extreme expression of what Targaryen rule looked like when its draconic power was still present, but its institutional legitimacy was in serious question. Maegor did not compensate for weak political relationships with brilliant statecraft. He compensated with Balerion, with executions, with a brutality so extravagant that it became its own kind of instability, driving the very great lords who might have supported a more temperate king into quiet opposition, building a reservoir of resentment that would eventually find its outlet in the reign of his successor. The lesson of Maegor's reign, that dragonfire without political intelligence is not a governance strategy, but a postponement of reckoning, was available to every Targaryen who came after him. Some absorbed it, others did not. Rhaegar Targaryen, the prince who was promised, the harpist, the scholar, the man who believed he was living inside a prophecy and made choices based on that belief that set the world on fire, Rhaegar is perhaps the most heartbreaking illustration of what the Targaryen decline looked like at the individual level. He was, by all accounts that survive, a genuinely thoughtful and capable person. He read deeply. He thought seriously about the nature of kingship and the prophecies that might govern its responsibilities. He believed that what he did with Lyanna Stark, whether abduction or elopement, the histories are deliberately ambiguous, was necessary, was fated, was part of something larger than either of their lives. He may have been right about the prophecy. He was catastrophically wrong about the political consequences. His father's madness had already strained the Great Lord's loyalty to the breaking point. What Rhaegar did with Lyanna provided the spark. And no dragon existed by that point, large enough or healthy enough to prevent the conflagration. Military historians have calculated that a medieval army of 10,000 men consumed roughly 60 tons of food every single day, not counting the horses, not counting the camp followers and craftsmen and surgeons, just the soldiers, 60 tons every day forward. In Westeros, where the nearest granary always belonged to a lord who might or might not be your ally by the time you arrived, this arithmetic was not a logistical detail. It was a death sentence written in advance. The night has grown a little quieter now. Let yourself feel that quietness as a physical thing, a settling, like the way a house makes small sounds when it exhales the heat of the day and begins to cool towards something more honest. You are in that cooling now. Let the sounds around you be distant and unremarkable. Let this voice be the thing closest to you. There is a dimension of the military problem in Westeros that almost never receives the attention it deserves, perhaps because it is not romantic. It involves no great swords and no legendary battles. It involves grain. It involves the extraordinary, grinding, unglamorous challenge of feeding large numbers of men over large distances across a continent with no standing logistical infrastructure. And when you understand what that challenge actually meant in practice, you begin to understand why wars in Westeros ended the way they did, why campaigns stalled when they seemed to be succeeding, why brilliant strategies collapsed into exhausted retreats that the history is recorded as mysterious failures of nerve. Every army in Westeros was a locust swarm with better armour. The moment a lord called his banners and began to march, he set in motion a consumption machine that would devour everything in its path, not from cruelty in most cases, but from simple necessity. Men at march need calories, horses need fodder. The supply lines of a medieval military force were not the clean logistical chains we might imagine from more modern conflicts. They were a series of improvised arrangements, local requisitions, and politely, or not so politely, enforced contributions from whoever happened to own the land the army was crossing. Let that image form in your mind and then let it drift. An army moving through the Riverlands, perhaps the most strategically significant and most historically devastated region on the continent, precisely because of its central location. Men in mail, horses blowing steam in the cold air. Behind the column, a landscape stripped of its winter stores, its livestock driven off or slaughtered, its granaries emptied. The small folk watching from the tree lines with an expression that has no name in High Valyrian or the common tongue, but is understood in every language. The look of people who know they will be hungry before spring. Allow your body to sink a little deeper now. Whatever tension remains in your shoulders or your jaw, you can release it. You do not need to carry it tonight. It will still exist in the morning if you want it back. Robb Stark's campaign against the Lannisters is perhaps the most instructive example of how the logistical problem operated at the level of high strategy. Robb was, by most reasonable military assessments, a tactically gifted commander. He won every battle he fought in the field. He outmaneuvered forces twice his size. He demonstrated an instinctive understanding of terrain and the positioning of forces that far exceeded his years. And yet his campaign ended in catastrophic failure, and the logistical dimension of that failure is almost always understated in favour of the political dimension. The political failure, the Frey betrayal, the broken marriage pact, was enabled by a logistical reality. Robb needed the crossing at the Twins not merely as a tactical convenience, but as a matter of survival for his army. He needed to keep his forces moving, keep them fed, keep them consolidated. The moment his campaign required him to make requests of powerful lords who had leverage over his supply lines and passage routes, he became dependent on those lords in a way that his military success could not offset. His victories in the field did not translate into the kind of structural independence that might have allowed him to refuse the Frey's terms. He was brilliant on the battlefield and helpless at the negotiating table. and the negotiating table was where the logistical reality ultimately forced him. But we should not let Robb's story obscure the larger pattern, which extends far beyond any single campaign. The Riverlands, the region that bore the brunt of the War of the Five Kings, was not devastated merely because it was strategically located, though it was. It was devastated because it was the granary of Westeros, and every army that moved through it treated it as an available resource rather than a system that needed to be preserved. The Lannisters stripped it, the Baratheon faction stripped it, the Stark forces stripped it, and then the winter came. It is worth sitting with the weight of that for a moment. The small folk of the Riverlands, the farmers and millers and fishermen who appear in the background of the story, who Arya moves through like a ghost during her long road south, they were not casualties of the War of the Five Kings in a simple, direct sense. They were casualties of a structural inability to fight a war without consuming the landscape. No army had supply lines that functioned independently of local requisition. No army had granaries on wheels that it carried with it. No army had a logistical infrastructure that allowed it to feed itself without feeding on the places it passed through, and so the people who had the worst luck of living in the places armies moved through suffered not for any political reason, and not because any particular lord wished them harm, but because the structural arrangement of military power in Westeros had never been designed with their survival in mind. The breath comes and goes, in and out. The quiet deepens at its own pace. A standing army, a permanent professional force paid from the royal treasury and quartered in royal barracks, would not have eliminated the logistical problem entirely. No institutional arrangement eliminates logistical reality, but it would have changed its character in important ways. A standing army is trained in logistics as well as combat. It develops institutional memory about supply management. It is fed in peacetime from centralized royal stores rather than improvised local requisition, which means the infrastructure for feeding it in wartime already exists in skeletal form. The great kingdoms of the real medieval world that maintained standing armies, however small by modern standards, consistently demonstrated greater logistical coherence than those that relied entirely on feudal levy. The Unsullied are, in this reading, not merely a narrative device for giving Daenerys a loyal military force. They are an argument in steel and silence for what a professional standing army actually looks like. Trained from earliest youth in a single discipline, fed and housed by their masters, possessing no lands, no loyalties, no harvest schedules, no wives waiting at home who make the men restless when campaign season runs long. They march when told, and stop when told, and eat what is provided. Their logistical footprint is not nothing, but it is calculable in a way that a feudal levy never is, because a feudal levy is not a single organism. It is a coalition of thousands of individual economic units, each making private calculations about how long they can afford to be away. What Daenerys understands about the Unsullied, and what she perhaps does not fully understand about the limits of that solution, is that a professional army is only as good as the institution that maintains it in peacetime. You cannot simply acquire an Unsullied army and then dissolve the infrastructure that produced it. The training, the housing, the feeding, the discipline, these require ongoing institutional investment. An institutional investment requires a crown that has revenue streams not dependent on the cooperation of great lords who may choose, at any moment, to remind you how dependent you are. The problem of the army and the problem of the grain were always the same problem. Westeros never had a military that it owned outright because it never had an economy that the crown controlled outright. The lords held the swords because the lords held the fields, and the fields were always more powerful than anyone who sat on a throne of swords acknowledged. Let that be the last thought of this passage, the image of fields stretching away into winter dark, stubbled and frozen, indifferent to crowns and campaigns alike, and the knowledge that whoever held those fields held everything. The specific geography of the Riverlands deserves more attention than it typically receives in analyses of the War of the Five Kings military campaigns, because the geography explains a great deal about why the region suffered so disproportionately, and why that suffering was, in a structural sense, almost inevitable, regardless of the intentions of the combatants. The Riverlands occupy the central corridor of Westeros, the zone through which any army moving from north to south, or from east to west must pass. The rivers that give the region its name are simultaneously its defining geographic feature and its greatest military liability. They provide water and fish and transport, but they also prevent any army from moving rapidly through the region without negotiating a series of crossing points, each controlled by a local lord, each representing an opportunity for delay, extraction, and political complication. Lord Edmure Tully's military decisions during the war are often criticised by readers of the story, and by Robb Stark within the narrative itself, as tactically short-sighted. The argument is that Edmure's insistence on defending every river crossing, on refusing to allow Lannister forces to advance into the Riverlands, cost Robb the strategic advantage he was trying to create. This criticism is correct in narrow tactical terms and profoundly unfair in human terms. Edmure was defending his own people. He was the lord of a region being systematically stripped and burned by an army that, whatever its strategic purpose from Robb's perspective, was experiencing itself as a catastrophe from the perspective of every village it passed through. The gap between Robb's strategic vision and Edmure's protective instincts was not a failure of either man's intelligence. It was the feudal system making itself visible. A great lord's primary obligation, in his own understanding and in the understanding of his people, was to protect them, not to sacrifice them for a larger strategic picture they could not see. The practice of ravaging, of systematically destroying the agricultural infrastructure of enemy territory to deny it to the opposing force, was a recognised military strategy in Westeros, as in every medieval military tradition. Tywin Lannister employed it with characteristic thoroughness in the Riverlands, not from excess cruelty but from strategic calculation. A Riverlands that could not feed an army was a Riverlands that could not sustain the Stark-Tully alliance. The strategy was militarily rational and humanly catastrophic, and the people who paid the price for its rationality were the small folk whose stores were burned, whose livestock were driven off, whose lives existed entirely outside the strategic calculations that determined their fates. The Freys are, in this military structural reading, not merely the architects of a particular betrayal, but the most lucid expression of what the feudal system produced when it was stripped of its sentimental overlay. Walder Frey understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had spent 90 years watching the great houses play their games, that he controlled a choke point. The twins sat on the only reliable crossing of the Green Fork for 100 miles in either direction. That geographic fact was more powerful than any army and more durable than any alliance. Every great lord who needed to move forces across the Trident had to deal with Walder Frey. Walder Frey had waited his entire life to be dealt with on terms of genuine equality, rather than barely concealed contempt, and when the moment arrived he extracted maximum value from it. His betrayal was monstrous. It was also, in the pitiless logic of the feudal system, completely predictable. The inevitable consequence of a structure that gave a man with his geography and his patience nowhere to go except toward the most extreme possible demonstration of his leverage. At its height, the Night's Watch was 10,000 strong, the largest professional standing army in the history of Westeros. Men who answered to no lord, men who owned no land, men who took vows that severed every private loyalty and left only one: the Watch, the Wall, the dark beyond it. It was the most complete solution to the standing army problem that Westeros ever produced. And then, over 3,000 years, the realm that created it simply stopped paying for it. By the time the real enemy arrived, there were fewer than 1,000 men left to face it. The deepest part of the night is close now. You can feel it in the quality of the dark, in the way small sounds have grown even smaller, in the sense that the world beyond the walls has gone as quiet as it ever gets. This is the hour that the Watch called the Deep Watch. The hours between midnight and the coming of false dawn when the cold was most absolute, and the sentries on the wall leaned into their cloaks and thought of fires they could not light. The Night's Watch was, at its origin, one of the most extraordinary institutional achievements in the history of Westeros. It was created in the aftermath of the Long Night, the generation-spanning winter that nearly ended human civilization in the known world, as a solution to a specific problem that no feudal arrangement could address. The need for a permanent military presence at the northern edge of the world, answerable to no single king or lord, sustained across centuries regardless of who sat the Iron Throne or how the political weather of the south happened to be blowing. Think about what that actually required. In a society built on the principle that military power was held by lords who held land who answered to kings who held territory, the Watch was a deliberate and radical exception. Its members held no land. They could inherit nothing and bequeath nothing. They had no wives, no children, no heirs, no political affiliations south of the wall. When a man took the black, he stepped out of the feudal system entirely. He became, in the most literal sense, a man of the realm rather than a man of any particular house or region. He became what Westeros had never managed to produce anywhere else, a soldier who belonged to everyone and therefore to no one in particular. Let your breathing settle. Notice how the exhale takes a little longer than the inhale, how the body wants to breathe out more than it breathes in at this hour, as if releasing the weight of the day in slow installments. You do not need to control it, simply notice it and let it continue. The original funding mechanism for the Night's Watch was a masterpiece of structural thinking, though it was never written down in any single document that survives. The great lords of the realm were expected to send men, condemned criminals, second sons with no inheritance, landless knights with no patron, and to contribute to the Watch's supply from their own stores. The Crown supplemented this with direct grants. The system was not elegant, but it was distributed enough to be resilient. When one lord's contribution fell short, others compensated. When the Crown was distracted by southern politics, the lords of the north, who could actually see what the Watch was protecting against, maintained the flow. But that system had a fatal vulnerability, and it was the same vulnerability that afflicted every other military arrangement in Westeros. It was based on voluntary contributions from parties with competing interests, rather than on mandatory assessments enforced by a power capable of compelling compliance. In the centuries of relative peace after the Long Night, as the White Walkers faded into legend and the wildlings became the only visible threat north of the wall, the feudal math began to shift. Why send your second son to freeze on a wall 300 leagues away when you could marry him into a minor lordship or make him your master-at-arms? Why contribute grain to a garrison at the edge of the world when your own people needed feeding through the winter? One by one, over centuries the contributions dried up. The Watch's castles emptied. The Shadow Tower, East Watch, the dozen and more fortresses built into the wall at intervals calculated for a garrison 10 times larger than the one they actually housed. These became hollow things, maintained out of tradition rather than function, operated by skeleton crews that could barely climb the wall's 700-foot face, let alone patrol the territory beyond it. The Watch became, gradually, and without any single dramatic decision, a ghost of the institution it had been. This is the catastrophe that Jon Snow inherits, not the White Walkers, not the Wildling army. The catastrophe Jon inherits is institutional. He becomes Lord Commander of an organisation that has been systematically defunded for 3,000 years by the very realm it exists to protect, and he must somehow rebuild enough of that institution to face an existential threat with fewer men than a single Great Lord commands. If you are still awake, that is entirely fine. There is no obligation to sleep, no test being administered. Simply rest and let the story move at whatever pace is comfortable. The specific tragedy of Jon's position is that he understands the structural problem with a clarity that most lords in the south never achieve, and that understanding is precisely what gets him killed. He sees that the Watch cannot hold the wall with its current numbers. He sees that the wildlings, however they have been framed as the enemy, are human beings running from something that will kill them and then use them against the living. He sees that the only rational response to the threat beyond the wall is to massively expand the number of people on the southern side of it, which means making political decisions, letting the wildlings through, forming alliances that violate the Watch's traditional neutrality, that the men under his command experience as betrayal. He is right about the structural reality, and he is killed for it. This is perhaps the most precise and painful articulation in the entire narrative of what happens when an individual understands a systemic problem clearly and acts on that understanding within an institutional framework that is not designed to receive such action. The men of the Night's Watch did not kill Jon Snow because they were wrong about the threat. They killed him because their institutional culture, built across 3,000 years of a specific kind of military discipline, could not process the command he was giving them. The system ate the person who understood the system's failure. That is a very old story. It has nothing to do with magic or dragons. It happens in every civilization that has ever existed. The Watch is, in the end, the most poignant monument to the standing army problem in Westeros. It was the answer. For a brief, glorious period long before the events of the story, it was the functional solution to the structural contradiction at the heart of Westeros' military organisation, and it was allowed to decay, not through malice, not through any single catastrophic decision, but through the slow accumulation of rational self-interest on the part of thousands of lords and kings who each had individually defensible reasons for not contributing and collectively destroyed the only institution that stood between the realm and the end of the world. If the story you love drifts toward you now in fragments, a face, a name, the sound of wind over ice, let it come without reaching for it. These images do not need to be assembled into sense tonight. Let them float. If the Watch has caught your attention tonight, if these forgotten histories feel worth carrying forward, consider resting here with us regularly. The archives are deep, and there is always more to uncover. Sleep well and subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. The wall stands. 300 foot of ice compacted by 12,000 years of winters into something that is no longer quite ordinary ice. Something older and stranger, perhaps faintly enchanted by the magic of its builders, certainly indifferent to the concerns of everyone on either side of it. It does not know that the Watch has dwindled. It does not know that the realm has forgotten its purpose. It simply endures, as things built by Bran the Builder endure, beyond the span of the intentions that created them, beyond the memory of why they were necessary, into the cold and patient future. The Watch's 19 castles along the wall's 700-foot face were not built for the garrison sizes that the Watch maintained in its final decades before the events of the story. They were built for the Watch at its height, for the 10,000-strong force of the long-ago era, distributed across the wall's 300-mile length in enough density to maintain genuine surveillance of the territory beyond, and to respond rapidly to any threat that materialized at any point along that length. By the time Jon Snow arrives at Castle Black, 17 of those 19 castles are unmanned. The Watch holds 3, Castle Black itself, the Shadow Tower to the west, and Eastwatch by the Sea to the east. 3 garrisons to cover the territory that 19 were designed for. The remaining castles stand empty, their gates hanging open, their interiors slowly filling with snow, and the evidence of the animals that shelter there when the humans are absent. The abandonment of those castles is one of the most vivid physical monuments in the story to the process of institutional decay through defunding. Each empty castle represents a decision, or more precisely, a series of non-decisions, a slow accumulation of years in which contributions were not made and men were not sent, and the Watch's capacity contracted while the institution continued to insist, out of pride and tradition, that it remained what it had always been. The Watch never acknowledged its own diminishment in any formal sense. No Lord Commander ever sent a raven to the great lords saying, "We are at 1/10 of our required strength. We cannot fulfill our function. We require immediate and substantial assistance." The institutional culture of the Watch, its pride, its traditions, its sense of itself as the shield against the darkness, made such an acknowledgement feel like defeat rather than honesty. Jorah Mormont was perhaps the last Lord Commander who fully understood the scale of the Watch's decline, and was attempting, within the political constraints available to him, to address it. His great-ranging, the expedition beyond the wall that ended in disaster at the Fist of the First Men, was not merely an act of leadership but an act of institutional desperation. He needed to know what was beyond the wall. He needed to know it firsthand, with his own eyes and the eyes of the men he trusted, because the Watch's intelligence capacity had declined so severely that he had no other reliable way to understand the nature of the threat he was supposed to be guarding against. A Watch at full strength, with 19 active castles and regular ranging parties maintaining the territory, would have had continuous intelligence about the movements of wildlings, about the strange things happening in the haunted forest, about the dead rising from the cold ground. The Watch that Mormont commanded had almost none of this. He had to go see for himself, and it killed him. Sam Tarly's understanding of the Watch's institutional crisis is perhaps the most complete in the story, precisely because he approaches it from the angle of a scholar rather than a warrior. Sam knows, because he has read the histories, that there was a time when the Watch was something categorically different from what it has become. He has read about the rangings that extended hundreds of miles beyond the wall. He has read about the garrison numbers, the supply arrangements, the political relationships with the southern lords that maintained the Watch's capacity. and he has watched those numbers and those relationships dwindle in real time, experienced not as history, but as the daily reality of a man eating inadequate rations and training with inadequate equipment in an institution that the rest of the realm has effectively agreed to forget. His instinct to go to the Citadel and learn, to find, in the accumulated knowledge of the Maesters, some answer to the problem that muscle and steel cannot address, is, in structural terms, exactly right. The Watch does not need more swords, it needs more ravens, more knowledge, more institutional connection to a world that has been pretending it does not exist. In the entire War of the Five Kings, the single most important military question was never asked at any council table in any castle in Westeros. The question was this: when a lord of the realm calls his banners, how many of the men who answer are actually loyal to him, and how many are simply calculating which side is more likely to win? The difference between those two groups is the difference between an army and a temporary alliance, and Westeros never had a mechanism for knowing which it had until the first battle told it. There is a particular comfort in letting go of the need to understand. Not all the way, the mind never goes entirely quiet and it was not built to, but that quality of restful awareness, of listening without needing to respond, of being informed without being required to act on the information, that is available to you right now. Let it come. The story will carry itself. The Bannermen system was the connective tissue of Westerosi military power, the mechanism by which a great lord translated his political authority into armed force with enough speed to matter when crises arose. When a Stark called the banners of the North, ravens flew to a dozen houses: Mormont, Glover, Karstark, Umber, Manderley, Hornwood, Serwyn and more, each of which maintained its own fighting force, its own knights and conscripts and garrison soldiers. Those forces, in theory, answered the call, in theory. In Niha. The gap between theory and practice in the Bannerman system is where most of the political drama of Westeros actually lives, because the system operated on a fundamental assumption that was almost never explicitly examined, that the loyalty binding a bannerman to his liege lord was a fixed quantity, a constant that could be relied upon in the same way one relies on the fact that a sword is sharp. This assumption was false. Loyalty was not a fixed quantity. It was a living thing, subject to cultivation and neglect, to injury and repair, to the constant pressure of competing interests. It was, in the most economically honest sense, a currency, and like all currencies, it was subject to inflation. Let that image rest in your mind for a moment. Loyalty as a currency. It is earned through consistent investment, through justice administered fairly, through debts honoured, through protection actually delivered when enemies came. It is spent through betrayal, through perceived insults, through the accumulation of grievances left unaddressed. And like a currency left too long without backing, it can lose its value, slowly at first and then all at once. Allow the muscles of your face to soften, the small tensions around the eyes, the almost imperceptible tightness at the jaw. You can let those go. There is nothing you need to hold on to tonight. The Karstarks are the most precise illustration of how this currency system worked and failed in the War of the Five Kings. Lord Rickard Karstark was a genuine and powerful Stark bannerman, his loyalty to the northern cause forged in personal grief when his sons died fighting for Robb. That grief was itself a form of investment. He had paid the highest possible personal price for his liege lord's campaign, and the expectation of reciprocal consideration was not unreasonable. When Robb executed him for killing Lannister prisoners in a moment of revenge-driven fury, he was making a choice between two legitimate principles: the military necessity of maintaining discipline and the diplomatic reality that executing one of his most powerful vassals would split his force in half. Robb chose the principle and lost the war. Or rather, and this is the distinction that matters, the structure chose for him. There was no institutional mechanism available to Robb that allowed him to address Karstark's grievance, acknowledge the genuine injury, maintain discipline, and preserve the political alliance simultaneously. The feudal system had no such mechanism. It was a binary: execute or pardon, command or concede. The nuance that the situation required was not available in the institutional vocabulary of the relationship between a great lord and his bannermen. But let us look further back, because the Karstark crisis was not an aberration. It was a symptom of a pattern that runs through Westerosi history in every era for which records exist. The problem of Bannerman loyalty was present in Aegon's Conquest, when several great houses chose to bend the knee not out of genuine conversion to Targaryen authority, but out of a calculation that resistance was futile. Those houses remained, in some structural sense, conditionally loyal. Loyal as long as the dragon was flying overhead. Loyal as long as the cost of rebellion exceeded the cost of compliance. Loyal as long as no sufficiently tempting alternative presented itself. The War of the Five Kings was possible only because the death of Robert Baratheon, himself a king whose authority rested almost entirely on personal charisma and the loyalty he had built through years of accessible, boisterous relationship cultivation, removed the animating centre around which the great lords had organised their conditional loyalties. Robert was not a great administrator. He was not a strategic military thinker. He was not a brilliant policymaker. What he was, with unusual natural talent, was a lord of the lords, a man who could sit across from another man and make him feel seen, feel valued, feel that his service and his loyalty were personally meaningful to the king himself. That quality is not transferable. It cannot be institutionalized. When Robert died, it died with him. Settle into the quiet now. The night outside is indifferent to all of this, and you're warm, and none of these lords are coming to ask anything of you. Let the story be simply a sound in the dark. What Robb Stark needed, what Stannis Baratheon needed, what Daenerys needed when she first arrived in Westeros, was not merely a larger army. What each of them needed was a mechanism for converting conditional loyalty into something more structural, for creating institutions that maintained allegiance independent of any individual relationship. Stannis understood this in his grim, loveless, brilliant way. He built the most genuinely meritocratic military force in Westeros because he could not inspire personal devotion. He rewarded competence instead of birth. He promoted based on demonstrable usefulness. His army was, in many ways, the closest thing to a genuinely professional force that the War of the Five Kings produced, and it was never quite large enough to win because it was built too late, from too thin a base of supporters who had chosen him from actual conviction rather than proximity to power. There is something worth carrying forward from Stannis' failure that applies beyond the world of the story. Meritocracy alone is not enough to sustain a military institution. You need meritocracy plus funding plus time. Time for the institution to develop its own culture, its own loyalty not to the individual at the top but to the organisation itself. The Night's Watch, in its best era, had that. Its men were loyal to the Watch before they were loyal to any commander. They would have followed a competent Lord Commander of humble origin as readily as a noble one. Stannis was attempting to build that culture in the middle of a war, under siege, with enemies on three sides. It was not enough time. And Daenerys, arriving with dragons and Unsullied and Dothraki, brought three forms of power that were each, in their own way, forms of non-feudal loyalty. The dragons answered to her alone. The Unsullied answered to their officers, and through them to her command. The Dothraki answered to her because she had performed acts in their presence that their culture interpreted as divine right. None of these were Bannermen relationships. None of them were conditional in the traditional Westerosi sense, and all of them became conditional in new ways the moment the dragons began to die. The final thought to carry into rest. A kingdom built on the right kind of loyalty does not need to fear every raven that arrives in the night. It does not need to wonder, at the moment of crisis, whether the man who has pledged his sword will actually use it on your behalf. That kind of kingdom is what Westeros was always straining toward, across 12,000 years of history, without ever quite achieving it. Let that striving be the last thing you think of tonight. Not its failure, but the reaching. The oath of fealty that bound a bannerman to his liege was, in its most formal expression, a comprehensive statement of obligation running in both directions. The bannerman pledged his sword, his service, his counsel, and his loyalty to the Lord's cause. The Lord pledged in return to protect the bannerman's lands, to dispense justice fairly within his domain, to honour the bannerman's rights and titles, to treat him as a valued partner in the project of governance, rather than merely an instrument of military force. This bilateral quality of the oath is crucial and chronically underappreciated in discussions of how the feudal system worked in practice. It was not a one-way extraction. It was, in its ideal form, a genuine compact, a relationship of mutual obligation that, when it functioned as designed, provided both parties with something they could not easily obtain alone. House Mormont of Bear Island is perhaps the purest surviving expression of what the Bannerman relationship was supposed to be. The Mormonts were never wealthy. Bear Island was never strategically significant. The house produced no great tournaments champions, no Master of Coins, no members of the King's Guard. What it produced, generation after generation, was genuine loyalty. The kind that held in bad weather, the kind that showed up without needing to be asked, the kind that Lady Lyanna Mormont eventually summarised in a single furious speech that shamed houses many times her own into remembering their obligations. The Mormonts were loyal to the Starks not primarily because the Starks were powerful, and not primarily because the relationship was strategically advantageous for Bear Island, but because across generations the Starks had been the kind of lords whose oath was worth honouring, fair in their judgments, present when needed, honest in their dealings with their vassals. This is the feudal relationship working as its designers intended, and it is noteworthy precisely because it is rare enough in the story to be remarkable. The contrast with the Boltons is the sharpest possible illustration of the Bannerman relationship at its most pathological. The Boltons were Stark Bannermen, in formal terms subordinate to Winterfell, obligated to the same bilateral compact that bound every northern house. But the history of the relationship between the Boltons and the Starks is a history of sustained, barely concealed hostility. The Red Kings who once ruled the North, independently before being conquered by the Starks, the practice of flaying their enemies that persisted as a quiet statement about where the Boltons truly believed themselves to stand relative to the families they had been forced to serve. The feudal oath did not transform the Boltons. It constrained them for a long time within the bounds of what they could do openly. It could not change what they were, and the moment the Stark power structure was sufficiently weakened, the constraint dissolved and what had always been there beneath it was revealed. House Frey and House Bolton represent in this analysis the two possible failure modes of the Bannerman relationship. The Frey's failure was transactional. They had never been ideologically opposed to Stark rule, but had always valued their own advancement above any abstract loyalty, and when the opportunity to advance their interests by betrayal exceeded the value of continued loyalty, they betrayed without sentimentality. The Boltons' failure was ideological. They had never accepted Stark dominance as legitimate, had merely accommodated it as a temporary reality, and their betrayal was not a calculation of advantage, but an expression of identity. Both failure modes produced the same result, the collapse of the military alliance that Robb's entire campaign depended on. But they illuminate different aspects of what was always fragile about the Bannerman system. The system could not distinguish, from the outside, between genuine loyalty and patient resentment. It could not see in advance which houses would hold when holding was costly and which would not. Every Master of Coin in the history of the Seven Kingdoms sat on a council that theoretically governed the most powerful realm in the known world, and not one of them ever had reliable knowledge of how many trained soldiers the Crown actually controlled at any given moment, not one. The number changed with every political season, with every alliance made and broken, every lord's health, every harvest that determined whether a vassal could afford to keep his garrison through winter. The Crown's army was a number that could not be counted because it did not, in any meaningful institutional sense, exist. You have been listening for a while now, and the voice has perhaps begun to feel like something familiar. Not intrusive, not demanding, simply present, the way a fire is present in a room even when you are not looking at it. Let it continue to be that. Let it be the warm background against which the rest of the night arranges itself. The small council of the King's Landing Court was, in formal terms, the administrative apparatus through which the Iron Throne governed the Seven Kingdoms. The Hand of the King, the Master of Coin, the Master of Ships, the Master of Laws, the Lord Commander of the King's Guard, the Grand Maester. These positions represented the functional departments of royal administration, each responsible for a distinct domain of governance. And yet the most critical domain of all, the military, was conspicuously absent from this structure in any meaningful independent form. There was no Master of War. There was no permanent position responsible for coordinating the realm's military readiness, for maintaining a census of trained fighters, for overseeing the training and equipment of a standing force that reported directly to the Crown. The Lord Commander of the King's Guard commanded 7 knights. The Commander of the City Watch commanded the Gold Cloaks, who were a police force rather than a military one. adequate for keeping the peace in King's Landing and inadequate for anything that required them to be somewhere else. Beyond that, the Crown's military power existed only in theory, only as a right of call on lords who might or might not respond with appropriate speed and appropriate numbers when the ravens went out. Let the tension of following all of this narrative drift away now. You do not need to hold on to any argument or follow any logic tonight. Simply let the words be sounds, and let the sounds be gentle, and let the gentle sounds carry you further from the sharp edges of consciousness. Tywin Lannister understood the small council's military impotence with the most precise clarity of any character in the story, which is part of why he was perpetually the most powerful man in King's Landing, despite rarely sitting the throne himself. Tywin did not need a title to exercise power because he had done what no king had managed. He had built something approaching a genuine professional military capacity within the Lannister family's domain. The Lannister armies were large, they were relatively well trained. They were fed from the extraordinary wealth of Casterly Rock and the gold of the Westerlands rather than from the uncertain tributary contributions of vassals. They were, as much as anything in Westeros qualified, an independent military force. This is why the death of Joffrey and the sequence of dynastic crises that followed it were so immediately threatening to the Crown's military position. Without Tywin, the Iron Throne lost not merely its most capable administrator, but its access to the only military force that could be reliably mobilized and supplied without navigating the full complexity of the Bannermen system. Cersei, inheriting the regency, inherited simultaneously the symbolic authority of the throne and the military reality that the throne's direct military power was almost entirely borrowed from her family. When the Lannisters moved against Joffrey, against Tyrion, against each other, they were not merely destroying a dynasty, they were consuming the only independent military capacity the dynasty had. It is worth sitting with this for a long moment. The small council was the brain of Westeros. It gathered intelligence, it formulated policy, it managed the realm's finances and its legal structure, but it had no hands, or rather, it had borrowed hands, aristocratic hands that came attached to independent bodies with independent interests, hands that could be retracted the moment those bodies calculated that retraction served them better than extension. Littlefinger understood this better than anyone, including Tywin, though he understood it from a different angle. Littlefinger was not a military thinker. He was not interested in armies in themselves. He was interested in the financial substructure that made armies possible, and his manipulation of that substructure, the debts he created, the creditors he identified, the way he moved money through channels that no one on the small council fully mapped, was not merely embezzlement on a grand scale. It was a systematic dismantling of the Crown's capacity to fund any independent military initiative. A king who is 40 million gold dragons in debt to the Iron Bank of Braavos and a dozen lesser creditors is not a king who can pay for a standing army. He is a king who must beg his great lords for soldiers and be grateful when they comply. The quiet deepens here, in this part of the night. Let it deepen, let the breath slow, just a fraction more. The maesters who ran the communication infrastructure of Westeros are another dimension of this problem that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The Raven Network, the system by which every castle communicated with every other, by which the Crown could theoretically coordinate military responses across thousands of miles in days rather than weeks, was administered by an organisation that was explicitly independent of any single lord or king. The Citadel trained the maesters, the Citadel assigned them, and while maesters took oaths to serve the houses to which they were assigned, those oaths had limits, and the Citadel's institutional interests were not always identical to the Crown's. This meant that the nervous system of Westerosi military coordination, the Raven Network without which no call to banners could be answered promptly, without which no strategic intelligence could flow from the borders to the capital in anything approaching real time, was not owned by the Crown. It was in effect licensed from an independent scholarly organisation that maintained its own separate institutional agenda. The maesters are rarely shown acting against the Crown's military interests in any overt way, but the structural fact of their independence meant that the Crown's military communication apparatus was, like everything else in its military structure, conditional. Varys, the Spider, the Master of Whisperers, his role on the small council was perhaps the closest thing to genuine independent military intelligence that the Targaryen and early Baratheon courts possessed. His network of little birds was not dependent on lords' cooperation, or raven availability, or seasonal weather that grounded birds or killed them. It was human-based, city-based, built on relationships of dependency and fear and mutual interest that Varys cultivated over decades. In this sense, Varys was attempting to solve the Crown's institutional military problem the only way he could within the existing structure, through intelligence rather than force, through knowing where threats were coming from early enough to neutralize them before they became military problems. But intelligence without the capacity to act on it is merely an encyclopedia of disasters. Varys could see what was coming. He could often see it further in advance than anyone else in the city. What he could not do was position a loyal Crown force to address it, because no such force existed. He could whisper warnings into the ears of hands and kings and council members. He could not dispatch a regiment. The emptiness at the centre of Westerosi military structure was not an emptiness anyone planned. It grew, like debt does, through the accumulation of small decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation. And now, as the night settles fully into its deepest register, let that emptiness be not a troubling thing but a restful one. The absence of armies means absence of their sounds. No boots on stone, no steel on steel, no ravens shrieking into a dark morning with news no one wants. Just quiet. Just this. Just the breath, and the dark and the long, peaceful interval between one moment and the next. The Gold Cloaks, the city watch of King's Landing, represent the closest thing to a royal standing force that existed in the capital during the Baratheon era, and their limitations are precisely calibrated to illustrate why a police force is not a military force. At their height, the City Watch numbered around 2,000 men. They were tasked with keeping order in one of the most populous and volatile cities in the known world, patrolling the streets, managing the gates, suppressing the violence that was an ordinary feature of urban life in a medieval metropolis. For these tasks they were marginally adequate, though even at urban policing they were subject to corruption and political manipulation in ways that made their reliability questionable. The moment the Gold Cloaks were asked to perform military functions, to hold walls, to fight trained soldiers from outside the city, to project force beyond the gates of King's Landing, their limitations became catastrophic. The Battle of the Blackwater demonstrated both the possibilities and the limits of the Gold Cloaks as a military force. Under competent command and with their backs literally to the wall of their own city, fighting in terrain they knew intimately, defending against an attacker crossing water rather than advancing on land, they performed adequately. But adequately in a battle that was very nearly lost anyway, adequately in a defensive posture that gave them every possible advantage, is not the same as adequate as a general-purpose military force. Joffrey's departure from the walls during the battle, a moment of personal cowardice that became an organisational crisis, illustrated how the Gold Cloak's effectiveness was dependent on the presence of a motivating authority figure, in ways that a genuinely professional army would not have been. Professional armies develop unit cohesion and institutional culture that sustain them through command crises. The Gold Cloaks, at the moment of their greatest test, were still essentially a municipal organisation asked to perform as a military one. The relationship between the Crown's finances and its military capacity is one of the most important threads in the story, and it runs directly through the office of Master of Coin in ways that deserve more attention than they usually receive. The Master of Coin was not merely a financial administrator in the conventional sense. He was the person most responsible for maintaining the material foundation on which any Crown military initiative depended, the revenues that might theoretically pay for soldiers, the debt management that determined whether there were revenues to speak of, the trade relationships that underpinned the broader economy from which military capacity was ultimately extracted. When Littlefinger managed the Crown's finances, he was performing a kind of controlled demolition. His innovations, the loans, the debt instruments, the creative accounting, produced the appearance of a prosperous royal treasury while building a structure of obligations that would eventually make genuine Crown independence impossible. A king 40 million dragons in debt to foreign creditors and domestic lenders is not a king who can afford to tell his great lords that their military contributions are no longer necessary because he has built his own force. He is a king whose military options have been progressively narrowed by financial constraints until the only available option is continued dependence on the feudal system and its inherent instabilities. Whether Littlefinger understood this as a deliberate strategy of destabilization or simply as the most profitable way to manage an office he had been given is almost beside the point. The effect was the same. The Pycelle problem, that ancient shuffling Grand Maester who served on the small council for decades and whose primary loyalty was to the Lannisters rather than to any abstract notion of crown service, illustrates another dimension of the institutional fragility. The maesters who populated the small council, who transmitted the ravens, who advised the kings on matters of history and medicine and governance, were not crown employees in any meaningful sense. They were citadel employees, seconded to royal service, and the citadel's relationship with royal power was its own long and complicated history of careful independence. When Pycelle chose to serve Tywin's interests over those of the king he nominally advised, he was not behaving anomalously. He was behaving in the only way his institutional position allowed, as a man whose deepest loyalties ran to his own network, his own history, his own assessment of which powerful patron was worth cultivating. The small council, the brain of Westeros, was full of people like this, technically in service to the crown, actually in service to a complex web of personal and institutional affiliations that the crown could shape but never fully control. 6,000 years before the events of the story, an entire civilization arrived on the shores of Westeros and systematically dismantled what had existed before it. Not in a single campaign, not in a generation. Over centuries the Andals crossed the narrow sea from Essos, and they brought with them something the first men had never encountered in quite this form. A theology of conquest, a religion that told them the land they were taking had been given to them by their gods, that the people they were displacing were not merely enemies but obstacles to a divine plan. The combination of military pressure and ideological certainty is, historically, one of the most destabilizing forces a civilization can face. Westeros has never fully recovered from it. Let the hours pass without accounting for them tonight. There is no need to track the time, no value in knowing how far into the night you are or how far from morning. Simply be here, in whatever warmth you have arranged around yourself, and let the centuries unspool at their own pace. When we speak of the military structure of Westeros, we tend to focus on the periods of documented history, the conquest, the major wars, the events that appear in the records the maesters kept. But the structure we are examining was not built in those eras. It was built over thousands of years, and one of the most formative of those foundational periods is one that receives relatively little attention: the long centuries of the Andal invasion and the cultural transformation it imposed on the continent. The first men who arrived in Westeros some 12,000 years before the story's present had their own military structures, their own tribal arrangements, their own compacts with the children of the forest and with each other. Those structures were relatively decentralized even by the standards of what came later: small kingdoms, petty kings, blood ties rather than feudal oaths, the Weirwood trees and their watching faces as the closest thing to a shared institution across the whole of the continent. The first men fought each other constantly, as peoples who share a continent and scarce resources tend to do, but their fighting had a quality of localism to it, a sense that the conflicts were bounded by the relationships between specific groups rather than by ideological imperatives. The Andals brought something different. They brought the faith of the Seven, a sophisticated theological structure that organized the world into the divine and the profane, the saved and the unsaved, the lands blessed by the Seven and the lands that waited to be claimed for them. They did not merely want to conquer territory, they wanted to transform it, to replace the Weirwoods with septs, to replace the old gods with the new, to remake the cultural landscape as thoroughly as the physical one. This ideological dimension of the Andal invasion transformed what might have been a series of territorial conflicts into something more systematic and more sustained. The breath comes and goes, the night continues, you're not required to hold any of this with particular effort. The military consequence of the Andal invasion that most directly shaped the Westeros we recognize was the destruction of the children of the forest's influence and the marginalization of the old ways that had, in various forms, provided the first men with a collective point of reference beyond immediate tribal loyalty. The Weirwood network, those pale-barked, blood-leaved witnesses spread across the continent, interconnected in ways that even the first men did not fully understand, represented a form of communication and shared cultural memory that had no direct Andal equivalent. When the Andals cut down the Weirwoods in the south, they were not merely committing an act of religious desecration, they were dismantling an infrastructure. consider what the Weirwood network might have meant in military terms, in an era when the Greenseers, those rare individuals capable of seeing through the faces carved in the heart trees, were more numerous and more active than they are by the time of the story's present. A Greenseer looking south from the north, watching through the faces of trees distributed across thousands of miles, would have had something approaching strategic intelligence of a kind that had no equivalent in any feudal council chamber. The old magic was not military in the direct sense, but it provided its practitioners with a form of situational awareness that was, in its own way, exactly what Westeros's military structure always lacked, a means of knowing what was happening beyond the horizon without depending on ravens that could be shot down or messages that could be intercepted. The Andal's theological rejection of the old ways, their methodical destruction of the Weirwoods wherever they established dominance, was thus not merely a cultural erasure. It was the elimination of a potential institutional military advantage that the first men had either never learned to fully exploit, or had lost the capacity to exploit as the Greenseers became rarer. By the time the White Walkers return in the story's present, the Weirwood network has been reduced to remnants, strong in the north, where the Andals never fully penetrated, but gone from the south, where it might have provided the most critical warning. Let this thought drift into the dark now, slowly and without urgency. The Weirwoods are still standing in the north. The old knowledge is not entirely gone. Let that be a comfort of sorts. The Andal invasion also, more directly, established the particular flavour of feudal organisation that would characterise Westeros through the rest of its history. The Andals brought with them the cultural presuppositions of Essos, a continent with its own long history of city-states, trade relationships and political arrangements based on contract and covenant, rather than purely blood ties. The feudal system that emerged from the fusion of First Men traditions and Andal governance was not purely either. It was a hybrid, and like most hybrids, it inherited some of the strengths of both parents and many of the weaknesses. From the First Men, it inherited the emphasis on personal loyalty and blood obligation, the idea that a man's primary duty was to his family, his lord, his ancestral gods, in roughly that order. From the Andals, it inherited the more formal contractual dimension of the relationship between lord and vassal, the notion that loyalty was a sworn covenant with specific terms, enforceable in the courts of the faith. These two foundations were not always compatible. Personal loyalty and contractual obligation point in the same direction most of the time, but at moments of crisis they diverge, and Westerosi history is littered with the wreckage of those divergences. The North's resistance to the Andal invasion, its stubborn retention of the old gods, the old ways, the Weirwood still standing in every great keep and village, is not merely cultural conservatism. It is, in structural terms, the preservation of an alternative institutional framework. When Ned Stark prays at the Heart Tree in Winterfell's Godswood, he is not merely performing a personal ritual, he is participating in an institutional form that predates the feudal system, that operates outside the feudal system's logic, that connects him to a tradition of obligation and witness that does not run through lords and kings and councils. Whether this makes the North more resilient or merely different is a question the story explores without quite answering. If you found yourself returning to these deep histories night after night, the kind of lore that most channels never reach, then rest here as often as you like. Subscribe to keep the archive close. The next story is already being prepared for you. The Andal invasion ended, as most migrations end, not in a clean victory for either side, but in an integration that was more complex and more costly than either the Andals or the First Men would have chosen. The South became Andal. The North remained First Men, and the line between them, running through the neck defended by the Crannog men in their floating keeps, became one of the most significant cultural boundaries in the world, one that persists into the present of the story and shapes the psychology of every character who crosses it. Jon Snow, half Stark and half Targaryen, carries both traditions in his blood without fully belonging to either. Perhaps that is precisely why he alone can see clearly what both of them have been failing to address. The children of the forest who survived the Andal invasion, retreating further into the deep woods, into the marshes, into the cave systems beneath the hills, carried with them a military tradition that was categorically different from anything either the First Men or the Andals had developed. Their weapons were dragonglass, not steel. Their tactics were ambush and concealment, the patient use of terrain that intimate knowledge provides, the exploitation of magical abilities that could not be replicated or defended against by conventional military means. They were, in a meaningful sense, the original Special Operations Force of Westeros, a small number of highly capable fighters whose effectiveness depended not on mass but on precision, on knowledge, on the application of a very different kind of warfare against enemies who had no framework for understanding what they were facing. The pact, the agreement between the First Men and the Children of the Forest that ended their millennia-long conflict, was one of the most significant military-political arrangements in the continent's history, though it tends to be treated primarily as a cultural or religious moment rather than a strategic one. What the pact actually represented was a mutual recognition of military stalemate. The First Men could not destroy the Children without paying costs that made destruction self-defeating, and the Children could not expel the First Men without capabilities they no longer possessed, if they ever had. The pact was therefore not a document of peace in any idealistic sense. It was a negotiated equilibrium, a mutual withdrawal from a conflict that neither party could win outright, formalised in the carved faces of Weirwoods that would serve as witnesses precisely because they were the one medium of communication that neither party could falsify. When the Andals came and the Children retreated north of the Neck, they brought with them something that would prove, 10,000 years later, to be the most important military asset in the story. The knowledge of how to create the Night King, how to transform a human being into a weapon against the dead. The Children created the White Walkers in desperation, as a defence against the First Men who were cutting down their sacred trees and reducing their numbers. The creation was catastrophic, a weapon that escaped the control of its creators and became an existential threat rather than a defensive one. But the knowledge behind the creation, the understanding of the magic that could animate the dead, was preserved in the memory of the last surviving Children, waiting for the moment when someone who needed it could find it. Bran Stark's journey to the Three-Eyed Raven, his crossing of the wall, his passage through the deep forest, his arrival at the cave beneath the Heart Tree, is, in military terms, the most important intelligence operation in the story. He's not going north to fight. He's going north to learn, to access the accumulated knowledge of a surviving remnant of the oldest civilization in Westeros, to understand the nature of the enemy in a way that no amount of conventional military intelligence could provide. The Three-Eyed Raven cannot give Bran an army. What he can give him is the kind of understanding that, in the right circumstances, is worth more than any army. An understanding of origins, of weaknesses, of the specific nature of the magic that must be countered. Whether Bran ultimately uses that knowledge effectively is a question the story's ending answers imperfectly. But the structural logic of why that knowledge matters is clear. In a conflict where conventional military resources are inadequate to the threat, the decisive advantage may lie in understanding what the threat actually is. The Golden Company is the most disciplined, most reliable, most genuinely professional military force in the known world. 10,000 soldiers who have never broken a contract, veterans of a dozen campaigns across 3 continents, an organisation with institutional memory, trained logistics, and a leadership culture built across generations of exile. And when Cersei finally secures their services and brings them to Westeros, the closest thing to a standing professional army the continent has ever seen, she deploys them to hold King's Landing, and they accomplish nothing. Because the problem was never the quality of the soldiers, it was always the structure behind them. The hours have gone soft now. You may find that the boundary between waking and the first shallow waters of sleep has become difficult to locate precisely, that thoughts arrive and dissolve before they fully form, that the voice has become less a source of information and more simply a presence, warm, unhurried, requiring nothing. That is exactly right. Stay there, in that indeterminate place, and let the story continue around you. Across the narrow sea, in the free cities and on the dusty roads of Essos, there existed an entire parallel military economy that Westeros almost entirely failed to draw on when it mattered most. The sellsword companies, those mercenary organisations that constituted the dominant military force in the Essosi political landscape, represented something that the feudal system of Westeros had never managed to produce organically. Professional soldiers who sold their expertise rather than their hereditary loyalty, who could be hired, deployed, and paid off without any of the complicated vassalage obligations that made Westerosi military politics so treacherous. The sellsword tradition of Essos grew from a fundamentally different political environment. The free cities, Braavos, Myr, Lys, Toyrosh, Pentos, Volantis, and the others, were not feudal monarchies. They were mercantile republics, trading cities whose wealth derived from commerce rather than land, whose political structures reflected the priorities of merchants and bankers rather than knights and lords. In such an environment, the feudal levy made no sense. A merchant prince of Braavos did not have bannermen. He had employees, and when he needed soldiers, he hired them from people whose entire professional identity was built around the business of military expertise. Let the thought of commerce and calculation drift away. These are not thoughts for this hour. Let them go gently, replaced by something quieter. The Brave Companions, the Second Sons, the Stormcrows, the Company of the Cat, the Golden Company. These organisations were not mere gangs of desperate men willing to fight for coin, though that is sometimes how they are characterised by characters within the story who have reasons to dismiss them. They were professional military institutions with internal hierarchies, training regimens, logistical traditions, and, in the case of the Golden Company in particular, an institutional culture built across more than a century of operation. The Golden Company was founded by Igor Rivers, one of the great bastards of King Aegon IV, and its original membership was drawn from the Westerosi knights and soldiers who followed him into exile. It was, therefore, not merely a sellsword company in the Essosi tradition. It was a Westerosi military institution in exile, maintaining Westerosi martial traditions and Westerosi institutional culture, while operating within the Essosi economic framework. This is what made the Golden Company genuinely different from the Westerosi Bannermen system, and genuinely dangerous to any power it turned against. Its loyalty was contractual in the Essosi sense, bounded by the terms of its agreement, but its training and discipline were Westerosi in their foundations, which meant it could operate effectively in the kind of terrain and tactical environment that Westerosi warfare actually involved, unlike purely Essosi forces who might struggle with the particular demands of storming a hill castle in a northern winter. Daenerys' relationship with the sellsword companies she encounters in Essos is instructive in exactly the way Cersei's relationship with the Golden Company is instructive, though they illuminate different aspects of the problem. Daenerys repeatedly refuses, renegotiates and transforms the sellsword contracts she enters into. She converts the Second Sons from mercenaries fighting against her to soldiers fighting for her through a combination of demonstrated power and genuine conviction. Through the quality that she has that pure coin cannot purchase, she believes in what she is doing, and that belief is contagious. Jorah Mormont follows her because of it. Barristan Selmy follows her because of it. Even Daario Naharis, a professional whose loyalty had always been an entirely commercial proposition, is moved by it. But conviction is not an institution. Conviction dies when the person embodying it dies, or is diminished, or makes choices that fracture the faith of those who followed it. The moment Daenerys burns the Tarlys, the moment she demands unconditional obeisance from men who had surrendered with an expectation of mercy, the conviction she has inspired begins to curdle in her followers. The unsullied remain, the converted sellswords wonder, and the structural problem reasserts itself. She has an army, but does it belong to her truly? Or does it belong to the version of her that they agreed to follow, a version she's increasingly departing from? The breath comes and goes without effort. The night asks nothing of you. Let everything you have been carrying become a little lighter. Tyrion Lannister's appreciation for sellswords, his use of Bronn, his understanding of Shagga and the hill tribes as a form of military contracting, his instinctive comfort with the transactional nature of a relationship, where both parties know exactly where they stand, is not merely a character quirk. It is a sophisticated recognition of the feudal system's vulnerability. Tyrion cannot inspire the kind of deep personal loyalty that his father commands through fear, or that Robert commanded through warmth. He is too ugly, too cynical, too obviously clever for people to trust with the unreflective devotion that drives Bannerman loyalty. What he can do is structure relationships clearly enough that both parties know their interests are aligned, and let that alignment do the work that personal devotion cannot. Bronn is the purest expression of this philosophy in the story. He's not loyal to Tyrion in any traditional sense. He likes Tyrion. He finds Tyrion entertaining and reasonably fair, but his primary loyalty is to his own survival and advancement, and the relationship with Tyrion is valuable precisely to the extent that it serves that primary loyalty. This is the sellsword model in its most distilled form. Complete transparency about the terms of the relationship, complete clarity about what each party is and is not committed to. It is less romantic than the Bannermen oath. It is considerably more honest. What Westeros might have looked like with a genuine system of professional contracted military service at the royal level, something like a permanent cause of sellswords under direct crown employment, with standardised terms, regular pay drawn from royal revenues, and a command structure that answered to the throne rather than to any great lord, is one of the great counterfactual questions of the continent's history. Such a system would have faced significant opposition from the great houses, who would correctly have perceived it as a reduction of their own military leverage. It would have required a level of centralised royal revenue that the existing feudal system made almost impossible to achieve, and it would have required a series of kings sufficiently committed to the project to maintain it across generations, through peacetime when its costs seemed unjustifiable, and through the constant political pressure of lords who preferred the existing arrangement. None of those conditions ever aligned. The sellsword companies remained an Essosi phenomenon, available for hire to Westerosi lords with sufficient coin and sufficient desperation, but never integrated into the institutional framework of Westerosi governance in any permanent way. The Golden Company came to Westeros too late, in service of the wrong cause, and accomplished nothing lasting. And the professional military tradition it represented, the closest thing to a real answer to the standing army problem, departed again with the conflict's resolution, leaving the continent as militarily fragile as it had always been. The stars, if you can imagine them through whatever ceiling is above you, are as indifferent to all of this as they have always been. They watched the first men cross the land bridge. They watched the Andals beach their boats on the western shores. They watched Aegon's dragons darken the sky over the reach, and they will watch whatever comes next with the same magnificent unconcern. Let that indifference be restful. In the scale of stars, all the anxieties of a single night are very, very small. The sellsword culture of Essos produced over centuries a body of military doctrine that Westeros largely failed to absorb despite repeated contact with it. The great captains who led the most successful companies, men like Igor Rivers before his exile, men whose names appear in the fragmentary histories of Essosi campaigns, had developed sophisticated approaches to the problems of logistics, unit cohesion, and tactical flexibility that the feudal levy system of Westeros never needed to address because it never needed to sustain itself over long campaigns without the backing of a territorial lord. The sellsword company that survived 10 years of continuous operation in Essos had developed by necessity the kind of institutional competence that only comes from repeatedly confronting and solving the problems that kill armies. Supply in hostile territory, command continuity when leaders die, maintaining unit morale through defeats as well as victories. Daario Naharis, whatever his other qualities, represents something genuinely unusual in the world of the story. A man whose entire professional identity is built around military excellence, divorced from any particular loyalty or territorial claim. He is not defending his ancestral lands, he is not avenging a family dishonour, he is not pursuing a claim to a throne, he is exercising a craft, the craft of organised violence, with the confidence and precision of a master, and his willingness to place that craft in service of Daenerys is not loyalty in the traditional sense. It is in its way more honest than most of the loyalty that surrounds her, precisely because it acknowledges its own conditional nature without apology. He will be there while being there serves him. He will not pretend otherwise. In a world full of lords proclaiming eternal fealty and then recalculating, there is something almost refreshing about a man who simply says, "I am here because it suits me, and I will tell you when it no longer does." The Company of the Rose, the Company of the Cat, the Long Lances, these less celebrated Essosi sellsword organisations represent the broader ecosystem from which the Golden Company emerged as its most developed expression. Most of them did not survive long enough to develop the institutional depth that the Golden Company achieved through its particular combination of Westerosi exile culture and Essosi professional norms. They were organisations that formed around specific commanders and dissolved when those commanders died or were bought away. What the Golden Company had that most companies lacked was a founding myth powerful enough to bind successive generations. The dream of return to Westeros, the promise of the restored Blackfire claim, the sense that the company existed for a purpose beyond the next contract. This mythological dimension of organizational culture is not merely sentiment, it is a genuine institutional resource. People will endure more, sacrifice more, maintain discipline through more difficult circumstances when they believe their organization stands for something beyond its immediate function. The Golden Company's founding myth was ultimately hollow. The Blackfire cause was spent long before the company arrived in Westeros, but the institutional culture it had built around that myth was real, and it outlasted the myth that created it. The tragedy of the Golden Company's deployment by Cersei is therefore not merely tactical, but almost philosophical. Here was the most fully realized expression of professional military culture that Westeros had ever seen, brought to the continent for the first time in its history, placed in service of a cause, Cersei's personal survival and the continuation of her line's power, that was precisely the wrong use of such an instrument. The Golden Company was not designed to hold a city. It was designed to move, to campaign, to apply force precisely and then relocate. Cersei used it as a garrison, as an expensive security blanket, as a symbol of her invulnerability in a situation that was already beyond any individual's control. And when the dragons came, the most professional army in the world's history discovered, as every army before it had, that there was no institutional response adequate to fire falling from the sky. Every military strategist in the history of Westeros has had to plan around a fact that makes Westerosi warfare categorically different from any real-world military tradition. They do not know when winter is coming, not in the metaphorical sense, in the most literal, logistical, operational sense. A campaign that begins in a mild autumn might end 3 years later in the teeth of a winter that has no precedent in living memory. A garrison built for 10 years of normal seasonal rotation might be asked to survive a winter that lasts a generation. No army in the world has ever been asked to plan around the possibility that the season it begins marching in may not be the season it ends fighting in, or even the decade. Something has shifted in the quality of the quiet. If you have been listening for a while now, you will recognize the feeling, a sort of deepening, like the moment in the early morning when the last birds go silent and there is a pause before any others begin. That pause, rest in it. There is nothing needed from you on the other side of it. The unpredictability of seasons in Westeros is one of the most fascinating and underexplored consequences of the continent's magical geography, and its military implications have shaped every campaign and every strategic calculation since the first warband picked up a spear and looked at its neighbour's territory with interest. In a world where summer might last 10 years and winter might last a generation, military planning cannot be built on the seasonal assumptions that governed warfare in every comparable real-world civilization. In the medieval period of the real world, warfare was deeply seasonal. Campaigns began in late spring when the roads had dried from the winter mud. They proceeded through summer when food was available from the land itself. They typically ended before autumn's rains made roads impassable, and before winter's cold made sustained campaigning a death sentence for both sides. This rhythm, so reliable that it was nearly a law of warfare, allowed military planners to operate with at least one certainty in an otherwise deeply uncertain environment. Whatever else was unknowable, the seasons were not. In Westeros, this certainty did not exist. A lord calling his banners could not know whether his men would be marching for 2 months or 2 years. He could not know whether the crops his army would depend on were months from harvest, or years from the next growing season. He could not know whether the passes through the mountain ranges that defined his strategic options would be clear in a month or frozen shut for a decade. Every military campaign in Westeros carried an additional layer of uncertainty that had no equivalent anywhere else in the known world, and the institutional responses to that uncertainty, or rather, the failure to develop adequate institutional responses, is one of the most significant contributors to Westeros's perpetual military fragility. Let the breath slow just a little more now. There is no urgency in any direction. Let the words become sounds, and the sounds become texture, and the texture become simply the quality of the night itself. The harvest festivals that marked the rhythm of Westeros' agricultural life were not merely celebrations. They were, in the deeper structural sense, the calendar by which military power was measured and renewed. A lord's fighting capacity in any given year was directly tied to the quality of his recent harvests. A bad harvest meant less food for his garrison, fewer able-bodied men who could be spared from the fields to train in arms, less capacity to equip and supply a levy even when it was technically his obligation to provide one. The feudal system presumed agricultural productivity as its foundation, and when that productivity faltered, from drought, from blight, from early frost, the military capacity that rested on it faltered correspondingly. Joffrey's decision to continue the War of the Five Kings into what would prove to be a difficult growing season was, in military terms, catastrophic, though the specific military disaster it precipitated, the food shortages in King's Landing that sparked riots and almost cost him his life, was perceived at the time as a governance failure rather than a strategic one. The riots over bread were not merely poor people being hungry, they were the military economy of the feudal system making itself visible in the most direct way possible. The crown could not feed its own capital because the war it was fighting had disrupted the agricultural system that fed everyone, and the disrupted agricultural system reduced the fighting capacity of everyone involved in an accelerating spiral that no single brilliant move could reverse. The long winter that Westeros was sliding toward during the events of the story, the winter that everyone knew was coming even before the White Walkers made it feel immediate, was therefore not merely a climatic event, it was a military event. Every day of winter was a day when the feudal system's military capacity contracted, when lords who might have called their banners in summer could not justify stripping their already strained garrisons, when supply lines that functioned adequately in clear weather became death marches through snow, when the entire architecture of provisional military alliances became even more conditional than usual because the underlying economic foundation was under stress. It is worth holding that image gently, the weight of winter pressing down on everything, the way it simplifies some choices and makes others impossible. Let it be a kind of relief. Nothing is expected of anyone in the deep of winter except survival. Stannis Baratheon's campaign in the north is the clearest demonstration of how the intersection of seasonal uncertainty and structural military fragility could destroy even the most carefully organised campaign. Stannis' force was probably the most professionally run army in the War of the Five Kings by conventional standards. A meritocratic command structure, relatively disciplined logistics, a genuine chain of command rather than the ad hoc coalition that most Westerosi armies amounted to. And it was stopped not by a superior military force, but by a Westerosi winter, and the logistical impossibility of sustaining an army in the field through conditions that no amount of military skill could manage without the kind of supply infrastructure that simply did not exist. Ramsay Bolton, for all his cruelty and his psychological darkness, was not wrong about the strategic situation. He did not need to fight Stannis. He needed only to wait, because the winter would do his fighting for him. This is the ultimate expression of how deeply the seasonal problem penetrated Westerosi military reality. A sufficiently entrenched defender in a sufficiently cold environment could defeat any attacker not by superior force, but by simply allowing the climate to operate as an ally. The wall, in its most extreme form, represents the same principle, elevated to the mythological level. The long night was not merely darkness. It was cold so profound that it reduced the military capacity of everyone south of it to near zero, making organised resistance essentially impossible. The Night's Watch was not built to fight the White Walkers in the field. It was built to hold a barrier while the cold made everything else irrelevant. Jon Snow's understanding of the coming winter's military implications is perhaps the most strategically sophisticated element of his character. He does not want to hold Winterfell against the Boltons because he has a personal claim to it, though he does. He wants to hold Winterfell because Winterfell is the only defensible position in the north capable of organising resistance to what is coming from beyond the wall, and what is coming from beyond the wall will be exponentially more devastating in winter than in any other season, because winter reduces the military capacity of the living, while apparently increasing the capacity of the dead, who do not eat, who do not feel cold, who have no harvest schedule and no supply lines and no bannermen who might decide at the worst possible moment that their interests have shifted. The dead, in this sense, are the perfect standing army. They require no food, they require no pay, they require no political management of complicated interpersonal loyalties. They simply accumulate and advance, season-independent, supply chain-independent, impervious to the logistical realities that have constrained every living army, in the history of the continent. They are what every king in Westeros always wanted and never had, and they are, of course, the absolute enemy of everything living. Let that thought dissolve now before it becomes too sharp. The dead are not here tonight. The night outside is cold, perhaps, but it is an ordinary cold, a human cold, the kind of cold that quilts and walls and the warmth of a resting body easily manage. Let the warmth of your own breath be the evidence that the winter for now is outside and you are inside. That is enough. The Meister's records of previous long nights, fragmentary, corrupted, in some cases apparently deliberately obscured, suggest that the pattern of seasonal catastrophe and military collapse had played out before the events of the story, not merely once but potentially multiple times across the continent's vast history. The long night that preceded the construction of the wall was the most extreme and most well-documented instance, but hints in the oldest accounts suggest that lesser versions of the same phenomenon, extended winters of unusual severity accompanied by threats from the north that conventional military responses proved inadequate to address, had occurred before. If this reading is correct, then the White Walkers are not an anomaly in Westerosi history but a recurring feature of it, and the entire recorded history of the continent, all 12,000 years of kingdoms and conquests and dynasties, has been happening in the interval between one visitation and the next. This reading transforms the standing army problem from a merely political and logistical issue into something with explicitly existential dimensions. If the White Walkers return on a cycle measured in thousands of years, then the relevant question is not merely how to organize military power for the next war, but how to maintain an institution capable of responding to a threat that operates on a timescale longer than any individual reign, any dynasty, any political system that has yet been sustained in Westeros's history. The Night's Watch was the answer to this question, built with the explicit recognition that the threat might not return for thousands of years, and that the institution needed to maintain itself across that interval without the presence of the threat to motivate its maintenance. That it failed to maintain itself is not a failure of the institution's design, but of the society's willingness to fund an institution whose purpose was not visible in any given generation. The psychology of institutional maintenance across very long time horizons is one of the most difficult challenges any civilization faces. Humans are reasonably good at maintaining institutions that address visible, present threats. The investment is clearly justified by the ongoing reality of the danger. They are considerably less good at maintaining institutions that address threats which have not materialized within living memory. The great lords who stopped sending men to the watch were not uniquely short-sighted or uniquely selfish by the standards of their era. They were behaving exactly as the feudal system's incentive structure directed them to behave, prioritizing visible, immediate interests over abstract, distant obligations. The tragedy is structural rather than personal. The Mormont family's relationship with the Night's Watch is, in this context, almost the only bright thread in the long story of the Watch's decline. For generations, the Mormont sent sons to the Watch and took the institution's obligations seriously in ways that most noble houses had long since ceased to do. Old Bear Mormont gave his entire adult life to the Watch, not from lack of better options, but from a genuine conviction, passed down through his family, that the Watch mattered, and that someone had to act as if it mattered even when no one else did. His daughter Lyanna, back on Bear Island, maintained that same tradition of taking obligations seriously when they were inconvenient, of showing up when others did not. There is a line of institutional conscience running through the Mormont family that is one of the most quietly dignified things in the story. Not glamorous, not celebrated, not rewarded in any conventional sense, but stubbornly present across the generations when it was needed. The Dothraki's military effectiveness in warm weather and their complete vulnerability to cold is perhaps the most pointed commentary in the story on the relationship between military power and environmental conditions. The greatest cavalry force in the known world, a people who had mastered the mounted warfare of the open plains to a degree that no settled civilization had matched, was essentially useless north of the wall, not because of any deficiency in skill or courage, but because the horses could not sustain themselves in that cold. The open field tactics that the Dothraki had perfected required terrain that the frozen north did not provide, and the psychological framework of Dothraki warrior culture had no framework for the kind of enemy they encountered beyond the wall. The dead do not fear horses, the dead do not flee, the dead do not respond to the display of superior force in the way that any human opponent, however brave, eventually must flee. The Dothraki discovered at the Long Night's second coming that every military tradition is shaped by the enemies it was built to fight, and the enemy beyond the wall was one that no tradition had been built to fight. The reconstruction that follows the Long Night, the second one, the one that ends the story, faces precisely the same structural problem that has plagued every reconstruction in Westerosi history. Bran Stark, the three-eyed raven, the boy who became something not quite human, sits the throne of a kingdom that has just barely survived its own military fragility, and there is not a single indication in anything we are shown that the fundamental structure, the lords, the banners, the conditional loyalty, the absence of any standing force answering only to the crown, has changed in any meaningful way. The wheel that Daenerys wanted to break has not been broken. It has merely completed another rotation. You have travelled a long way tonight, through 12,000 years of history, through the logic of grain and swords and loyalty and cold, through the Night's Watch in its glory and its abandonment, through the Targaryen calculation and the Andal invasion and the sellsword alternative and the impossible arithmetic of seasons, all of this from a resting place, without moving, without effort. The mind is extraordinary in this way. It can traverse empires between one breath and the next and then return and rest, and the body is none the worse for it. We come now to the final movement of tonight's story, and it is the movement that perhaps asks the hardest question. Not what went wrong in Westeros. We have spent a great deal of time on that, but what the pattern means. What it tells us about the relationship between institutions and individuals, between structures and the humans who inhabit them, between the systems we build and the ways those systems outlast the intentions that created them. Westeros never had a standing army. We have traced that absence through a dozen different expressions. The feudal bargain, the draconic substitute, the logistical impossibility of feeding levies across a continent, the Night's Watch allowed to decay into irrelevance, the Bannermen system's inherent instability, the small council's institutional impotence, the sellsword alternative that was never integrated, the seasonal arithmetic that made all planning conditional. These are not separate problems with separate causes. They are one problem with many faces, a civilization that distributed military power so thoroughly among its competing interests that the centre could never cohere enough to defend itself. Allow your eyes to be completely still now, behind closed lids or simply unfocused. Allow the thoughts that come to be fleeting, like birds crossing a window, present and then gone, not requiring you to follow them. The tragedy is that the pieces for something better were always present. The Night's Watch, at its height, demonstrated that a professional, non-feudal military institution was possible in Westeros, that men could be organised into a cohesive force without the complications of hereditary loyalty and competing vassalage, that such an organisation could maintain its coherence across centuries and command structures. The Unsullied demonstrated that professional soldiers organised around discipline rather than personal devotion were possible. The Golden Company demonstrated that Westerosi martial traditions could survive and thrive in an institutional form divorced from the feudal system. These were not imaginary alternatives. They were actual functioning models, each demonstrating one facet of what a standing royal army could have looked like. What was missing was not the knowledge or the capability. What was missing was the political will to impose the necessary restructuring in a moment when the existing power structure was simultaneously too strong to be overridden and too weak to prevent the crises that the restructuring would have addressed. Every king who might have built a standing army faced the same dilemma. The moment when you have enough power to impose the change is the moment when the change seems least necessary, and the moment when the change is most obviously necessary is the moment when you have least power to impose it. Aegon the Conqueror, fresh from his conquest, had sufficient authority to restructure the entire military system of Westeros. He declined because restructuring would have meant dismantling the great houses, which he needed to govern the continent, and because the dragons had solved the specific military problem he faced without requiring structural reform. He could not see, from inside his moment of maximal power, that his solution was temporary and the underlying problem permanent. It is worth pausing here, in this late and quiet hour, with that thought, because it is not a thought that lives only in the world of dragons and swords. The tendency to solve an immediate problem in a way that defers the structural issue, to find a workaround rather than a solution, to patch rather than rebuild, is perhaps the most human of all institutional instincts. It is everywhere in the historical record of every civilization that has ever existed, and it is recognizable in the scale of nations and in the scale of individual lives alike. The workaround feels like wisdom in the moment. It only reveals itself as deferral when the moment passes and the underlying problem resurfaces, as underlying problems always do. The breath comes in, the breath goes out. The night is very quiet now. Bran Stark, sitting in his wheeled chair on the throne that cost so much blood, is perhaps the most poignant monument to this pattern in the story. He is the three-eyed raven, a consciousness that encompasses 10,000 years of human memory, that can perceive the flow of time in ways no ordinary mind can access. If any individual in the history of Westeros should be capable of seeing the structural problem clearly and acting on it with the full weight of historical understanding, it is him, and yet the story ends before we see whether he does. The wheel completes its rotation, the lords sit in their council, the banners return to their halls, and the question of whether the patterns that have defined 12,000 years of Westerosi history will be addressed or merely deferred, one more time remains deliberately and honestly unanswered. Perhaps that is the most truthful thing the story tells us. Not that the wheel can be broken by sufficient will, or sufficient intelligence, or sufficient fire, but that the breaking of cycles requires something more and rarer than any individual genius. It requires institutional commitment that outlasts the individuals who undertake it, that survives the passing of the people who understood why it was necessary, that becomes embedded in the fabric of how a society organizes itself rather than existing only in the mind of a single three-eyed raven, or a single dragon queen, or a single idealistic Lord Commander of a Night's Watch that no one is funding. Ned Stark carried the honour of a man who believed that the institutions around him were sound enough to sustain it. Jon Snow carried the duty of a man who saw that the institutions were failing and tried to repair them from within at the cost of his life. Daenerys carried the vision of a woman who wanted to remake the institutions entirely and found that the fire required to do so was indistinguishable from the outside from the fire that destroys rather than builds. None of them were wrong. None of them were sufficient. The problem was older than any of them and larger than any individual response. The stories of Westeros are, in the end, stories about what happens when the structures that societies build to manage violence and power are not adequate to the violence and power they are asked to manage. They are stories about the gap between what institutions promise and what they deliver, about the humans who fall into that gap, about the enormous cost extracted from ordinary people, the small folk, the farmers, the riverlands villagers, the wildlings fleeing from something ancient and cold, by the failure of those at the top of the structure to address its fundamental contradictions. If these histories have been good company tonight, if the deep lore has been a comfort in the dark, then rest here whenever you need it. The archives are always open. Subscribe so the next story finds you easily. Sleep well, wherever you are. And now the watch is ended for tonight. The hours between this moment and the coming of light are yours. Quiet hours, warm hours, the most private and unhurried hours of all. Whatever the world holds for you tomorrow, it will hold it without requiring anything from you in the next few hours. The stories will be here in the morning. The history will keep. The long record of human striving and failing and striving again will continue its slow accumulation, as it has for 12,000 years and will for 12,000 more. Let your breathing go where it wants to go. Let your thoughts arrive and dissolve without any need to hold them or follow them. You have listened well tonight. You have travelled far. And now the only distance left to cross is the small, comfortable distance between wakefulness and sleep, a distance that, if you allow it, will cross itself. The wall stands in the dark, the weirwoods watch, the ravens sleep with their heads tucked, and you, in your particular quiet corner of a world that is older than any story can fully capture, are allowed to rest. Sleep well. If you enjoyed tonight's journey through the hidden history of Westeros, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments, and if there's a corner of lore you want me to explore next, leave it below. The Maester is always listening. The new small council that Tyrion assembles at Bran's crowning is, in many ways, the most institutionally interesting development in the story's ending, however briefly it is sketched. Bronn of the Blackwater as Master of Coin, Brienne as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Davos Seaworth in some advisory capacity, Sam Tarly presumably returning from the Citadel. These are not the conventional appointments of a conventional court. They are people chosen, in most cases, for demonstrated competence and genuine loyalty rather than hereditary standing or political alliance. This is, in its small way, a genuinely meritocratic council. The thing Stannis was trying to build at the military level applied to governance itself. Whether Bran and Tyrion can maintain this orientation through the pressures that governance inevitably generates is one of the questions the story leaves unanswered, and it is the right question to leave unanswered, because the answer will depend on institutional commitments that go far beyond any individual's intentions. Sansa Stark's insistence on northern independence is, in military terms, the most consequential political development of the story's ending, though it tends to be discussed primarily in terms of personal sovereignty and the North's traditional separatism. An independent North is a North that does not owe military service to the Iron Throne. An independent North is a North whose considerable fighting capacity, the full military resources of the largest region on the continent, is no longer available to the Crown except through renewed negotiation. If the wheel is indeed turning again, if the feudal system is reasserting itself in the aftermath of catastrophe, then Sansa's independence is not a triumph of regional identity over centralized tyranny. It is the feudal system completing another rotation, re-establishing the dispersal of military power that has always made Westeros vulnerable, now with the added complexity that the largest military region in the realm is formally outside the Crown's authority. Arya Stark sailing west, into the unknown ocean beyond the edge of the known world, is the narrative choice that sits most oddly alongside the story's political conclusion, and perhaps that oddness is the point. Arya has, throughout the story, been the character most completely outside any feudal framework. She has no army, she has no vassals, she has no lands and no intention of governing any. What she has is extraordinary personal competence, a unique set of skills developed through experiences that no institutional training could have produced, and an impulse toward discovery that the settled world of Westerosi politics has no place for. She is not a standing army, and she is not a feudal lord, and she is not a dragon queen. She's something the continent has not seen before, a purely individual agent of change, acting outside every structure the story has been examining. Whether the unknown West holds anything that matters to the story's themes is left open. But the gesture of sailing toward it, of heading into territory where no existing structure applies, feels like the only honest response to a world that has just barely survived the consequences of its own institutional failures. The reconstruction of the realm, whoever undertakes it and however they undertake it, will face the same fundamental challenge that every reconstruction in Westerosi history has faced: how to build institutions robust enough to outlast the people who build them, in a society whose every incentive structure pushes toward the personalization of power and the fragmentation of institutional authority. The answer is not dragons. The answer is not a single brilliant ruler. The answer is the slow, unglamorous, generation-spanning work of building genuine institutions. Armies that answer to the crown rather than to individual lords, councils that maintain their function through changes of monarch, legal frameworks that constrain even the powerful, communication and intelligence systems that belong to the realm rather than to any individual house. This work is less dramatic than any single conquest or any single battle. It has no moment of climax, no single scene of triumph. It is, in the most honest sense, the work that history is actually made of, beneath the surface of the events that get recorded.